Judge yells, "Remove this black man from my courtroom." Then the Chief Justice walks in and salutes him. A scream echoed through the courtroom. An enraged judge, red with fury, ordering a black man to be removed from the tribunal. But what nobody expected was what would happen in the seconds that followed. The Chief Justice walked through the door, saw the scene, and did something that would leave everyone in absolute shock. A salute. A gesture of respect that defied everything that Judge represented. What really happened in that courtroom? And why would such a powerful man do something so unexpected? The morning of September 12, 2015 in Atlanta, Georgia was like any other day at the Fulton County Courthouse. The building stood tall and imposing, a symbol of American justice. Inside, in Courtroom 7B, Judge Harold Whitmore, 68 years old, sat behind his elevated bench. Whitmore had been a judge for 40 years. He was a man of the Old South, with views that many considered outdated and deeply prejudiced. His reputation preceded him. Lawyers knew to be careful when appearing before Judge Whitmore. Witnesses knew to watch their words. And black defendants knew they were fighting an uphill battle. On that morning, Marcus Johnson, 42 years old, stood before the judge. Marcus was a black man with a quiet dignity about him. He wore a simple suit, pressed and clean. His eyes were steady, but there was a weariness in them that came from years of fighting a system that seemed designed to work against him. Marcus had been wrongfully convicted 15 years earlier. 15 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. A crime that had been committed by someone else. Someone who had never been caught. Marcus had spent those 15 years appealing his conviction, fighting through the courts, trying to prove his innocence. And finally, after all those years, new evidence had emerged. DNA evidence that proved Marcus could not have committed the crime. The case was being heard again. This was Marcus's chance at freedom, his chance at redemption, his chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. Judge Whitmore looked down at Marcus from his bench. His face was stern, his expression cold. He began to read the case details, his voice monotone and disinterested. But as he read, something changed. His face began to redden. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the edge of the bench. When he finally spoke, his voice was loud, angry, filled with a rage that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. He yelled at Marcus. He yelled about how criminals like him were destroying the fabric of society, how they were taking advantage of the system, how they were making a mockery of justice. And then, his voice rising to a crescendo, Judge Whitmore screamed the words that would echo through the courtroom and eventually through the entire nation. "Remove this black man from my courtroom." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone froze. The bailiffs looked at each other, unsure what to do. Marcus stood there, his face expressionless, but his eyes betraying the pain of what he had just heard. The court reporter's fingers stopped moving over her keyboard. The lawyers in the room held their breath. This was not just a judicial outburst. This was something darker. This was racism, naked and undeniable, displayed in the highest temple of American justice. And then, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. To understand what was about to happen, you need to understand who Marcus Johnson was. Marcus was born in 1973 in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta. His parents were working-class people. His father, James Johnson, 45 years old at the time, worked as a mechanic. His mother, Dorothy Johnson, 43 years old, worked as a nurse's aide at Grady Memorial Hospital. They were good people, honest people, who worked hard to provide for their family. Marcus had two younger sisters, Angela and Michelle. The Johnson family lived in a modest house on Ashland Avenue. It was not much, but it was theirs. Marcus grew up in a neighborhood that was struggling. Crime was high, poverty was widespread, but the Johnson family stayed strong. They went to church every Sunday. They believed in education. They believed in hard work. They believed that if you did the right thing, good things would happen to you. Marcus was a good student. He loved to read. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, of fighting for justice, of helping people like his parents who had been marginalized by the system. He graduated from high school with honors. He went to college at Atlanta State University. He was studying criminal justice, working part-time at a local law firm to pay his way through school. Everything was going well. Everything was on track. And then, in 1998, everything changed. A woman named Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, was assaulted in a parking lot near downtown Atlanta. She was brutally attacked, robbed, and left for dead. She survived, but she was traumatized. The police launched an investigation. They interviewed witnesses. They collected evidence. And then, they arrested Marcus Johnson. The evidence against Marcus seemed solid. A witness had identified him. His DNA was found at the scene. He had no alibi for the time of the crime. Marcus maintained his innocence. He said he had nothing to do with the assault. But nobody believed him. The system did not believe him. The jury did not believe him. In 1999, Marcus was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His dreams of becoming a lawyer died that day. His life as a free man ended. He was sent to the Georgia State Prison in Reidsville, a maximum security facility where he would spend the next 15 years. In prison, Marcus did not become bitter. He did not become angry. Instead, he became determined. He studied the law. He read every book he could find about criminal justice. He worked with other inmates, helping them with their appeals. He became known as a man of integrity, a man who refused to give up, a man who believed in justice. And then, in 2013, something miraculous happened. A new DNA testing technology became available. It was more advanced than the technology that had been used in Marcus's original trial. Marcus's lawyer, a young woman named Jennifer Chen, 35 years old, requested that the evidence from Marcus's case be retested using this new technology. The results came back. They showed that the DNA found at the scene did not match Marcus's DNA. It matched someone else, someone who had never been identified, someone who was still out there. Marcus's conviction was overturned. He was released from prison. After 15 years, Marcus Johnson was finally free. But freedom came with a price. He had lost 15 years of his life. He had lost his youth. He had lost his dreams. He had lost his family. His mother had passed away while he was in prison. His father had suffered a stroke. His sisters had moved on with their lives. Marcus had to rebuild everything from scratch. He got a job as a security guard. He lived in a small apartment. He tried to move forward. But he also wanted justice. He wanted the real perpetrator to be found. He wanted his name to be cleared completely. He wanted the system that had wronged him to acknowledge its mistake. And so, in 2015, Marcus's case was being heard again. This time it was an appeal to have his conviction officially vacated and his record expunged. This was supposed to be a formality. This was supposed to be a simple matter of justice being served. But Judge Harold Whitmore had other ideas. Judge Harold Whitmore was born in 1947 in a small town in Mississippi. His family was part of the old Southern aristocracy. His father, Colonel Robert Whitmore, 70 years old, had been a prominent businessman and a staunch segregationist. His mother, Elizabeth Whitmore, 68 years old, came from an old plantation family. Harold Whitmore grew up in a world of privilege and prejudice. He attended private schools. He went to the University of Mississippi. He studied law at Emory University. He was groomed to be a leader, to maintain the old order, to protect the interests of the white establishment. In 1975, at the age of 28, Harold Whitmore was appointed as a judge in Fulton County. He was young, ambitious, and deeply conservative. Over the next 40 years, he built a reputation as a tough judge, a law and order judge, a judge who was hard on crime. But there was something else beneath the surface. There was a deep-seated racism that informed his decisions. Statistics showed that black defendants who appeared before Judge Whitmore received harsher sentences than those who appeared before other judges. Cases involving black victims received less attention. Cases involving black perpetrators received more scrutiny. It was not always obvious. It was subtle. It was systemic, but it was there. Over the years, there had been complaints. Civil rights organizations had filed motions to have Judge Whitmore recused from cases, but nothing had ever come of it. He was protected by the system. He was part of the system, and the system protected its own. But there was a secret that nobody knew about Judge Whitmore, a secret that would eventually come to light. In 1968, When Harold Whitmore was 21 years old, he had been involved in an incident that had been covered up, an incident that involved a young black woman named Diane Foster, 19 years old. Diane had been a student at Spelman College. She had been walking home from campus one evening when she was attacked. She was assaulted and left for dead. She survived, but she was traumatized. She reported the assault to the police. She identified her attacker as a young white man who looked very much like Harold Whitmore. But the case was never prosecuted. The evidence disappeared. The witnesses recanted their statements. The case was closed. Diane Foster never got justice. She eventually left Atlanta and moved to California. She tried to move on with her life, but she never forgot. She never forgot the face of the man who had attacked her. And she never forgot the injustice of a system that had protected him. Decades later, in 2015, Diane Foster was living in San Francisco. She was 66 years old. She was retired from her career as a social worker. She was living a quiet life. And then she saw a news report about Judge Harold Whitmore. She saw his face on the television, and she recognized him. She knew without a doubt that this was the man who had attacked her all those years ago. She reached out to a journalist. She told her story. The journalist began to investigate, and the investigation led to the discovery of old police records that had been sealed. Records that confirmed that Harold Whitmore had been a suspect in Diane Foster's assault. Records that showed that the case had been covered up by powerful people who wanted to protect a young man from a prominent family. The journalist was preparing to publish the story. But before the story could be published, something else happened, something that would change everything. Chief Justice Robert Mitchell was 72 years old. He had been the Chief Justice of Georgia for the past 12 years. He was a man of integrity, a man who believed in the rule of law, a man who had dedicated his life to ensuring that justice was served fairly and equally. Mitchell had grown up in a different world than Judge Whitmore. He had grown up in a middle-class family in North Carolina. His father had been a teacher. His mother had been a nurse. They had instilled in him a sense of fairness and justice. Mitchell had worked his way through college and law school. He had built his career on merit, not on family connections or old money. He had a reputation as a fair judge, a judge who listened to both sides, a judge who made decisions based on the law and the facts, not on prejudice or personal bias. Mitchell had been following the Marcus Johnson case. He had read the court filings. He had reviewed the evidence. He knew that Marcus Johnson had been wrongfully convicted. He knew that Judge Whitmore's behavior in the case was inappropriate, and he knew that something needed to be done. On the morning of September 12, 2015, Chief Justice Mitchell was in his office in the Georgia Supreme Court building. He was reviewing documents when he received a call from a court clerk. The clerk told him that there was a situation developing in Courtroom 7B. Judge Whitmore was behaving erratically. He was making inflammatory statements. He was about to do something that could damage the integrity of the court. Mitchell decided to go to the courtroom himself. He wanted to see what was happening. He wanted to understand the situation. He left his office and walked down the hallway. He took the elevator down to the courtroom level. He walked through the corridors of the courthouse. And then he arrived at Courtroom 7B. He stood outside the door for a moment, listening. He heard Judge Whitmore's voice, loud and angry. He heard the words that the judge was saying. And then he heard the scream. "Remove this black man from my courtroom." Mitchell's face hardened. He knew what he had to do. He opened the door and walked into the courtroom. Everyone turned to look at him. The bailiffs stood at attention. The lawyers looked up from their papers. The court reporters stopped typing. And Marcus Johnson looked at this man who had just entered the courtroom, wondering who he was and what he wanted. Chief Justice Mitchell walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. He looked at Judge Whitmore. He looked at Marcus Johnson. And then he did something that nobody expected. He raised his right hand to his forehead. He performed a military salute, a gesture of respect, a gesture of honor, a gesture that said, without words, that Marcus Johnson was a man worthy of respect, that Marcus Johnson deserved justice, that Marcus Johnson deserved to be treated with dignity. The courtroom fell silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And in those few seconds, everything changed. Judge Whitmore's face turned white. He stood up from his bench. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The bailiffs looked at each other, unsure what to do. The lawyers whispered to each other. And Marcus Johnson stood there, tears streaming down his face, finally feeling like someone in the system believed in him, finally feeling like someone in the system respected him, finally feeling like justice might actually be possible. The moment Chief Justice Mitchell performed that salute, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Whitmore began to shout. He demanded to know what Mitchell was doing in his courtroom. He demanded that Mitchell leave immediately. He threatened to file a complaint against Mitchell for interfering with judicial proceedings. But Mitchell remained calm. He looked at Judge Whitmore and said, in a quiet but firm voice, that the proceedings in this courtroom were suspended, effective immediately. He said that Judge Whitmore was being removed from the bench pending an investigation into his conduct. He said that Marcus Johnson's case would be reassigned to another judge. And then he turned to Marcus Johnson and said, "You will receive justice. I promise you that." The bailiffs escorted Judge Whitmore out of the courtroom. He was furious, his face red with rage, his voice hoarse from shouting. But he had no choice. The Chief Justice had spoken. Within hours, the story had spread throughout the courthouse. Within days, it had spread throughout Atlanta. Within a week, it had spread throughout the entire nation. The media descended on the story like vultures. News outlets ran the footage of Judge Whitmore's outburst. They ran the footage of Chief Justice Mitchell's salute. They interviewed lawyers, judges, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens. Everyone had an opinion. Some people praised Chief Justice Mitchell for his courage. Some people condemned Judge Whitmore for his racism. Some people questioned whether the salute was appropriate. Some people defended Judge Whitmore, saying that he was being persecuted for simply expressing his opinion. The story became a national conversation about racism in the judicial system. It became a conversation about justice and injustice. It became a conversation about what it means to do the right thing, even when it is difficult. Marcus Johnson became a symbol of the wrongfully convicted, a symbol of those who had been failed by the system, a symbol of hope and redemption. He gave interviews. He told his story. He spoke about his 15 years in prison. He spoke about the pain of being wrongfully convicted. He spoke about the joy of finally being free. He spoke about the importance of fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes. A new judge was assigned to Marcus's case. Judge Patricia Williams, 55 years old, was a fair and impartial judge. She reviewed the evidence. She listened to the arguments, and she made a decision. She vacated Marcus's conviction. She expunged his record. She declared that Marcus Johnson had been wrongfully convicted and that his rights had been violated. Marcus Johnson was finally, officially, completely exonerated. But the story did not end there. There was more to come. There was a secret that was about to be revealed. As the media continued to cover the Marcus Johnson story, a journalist named David Chen, 48 years old, began to investigate Judge Whitmore's background. Chen was a seasoned investigative reporter who had won numerous awards for his work. He was determined to understand why Judge Whitmore had reacted so violently to Marcus Johnson's case. What was it about this particular case that had triggered such an extreme response? Chen began to dig into the archives. He found old court records. He found sealed documents. He found police reports that had been filed away and forgotten. And then he found something that changed everything. He found the police report from 1968, the report about the assault on Diane Foster, the report that named Harold Whitmore as a suspect, the report that had been sealed and buried for decades. Chen tracked down Diane Foster. She was living in San Francisco, retired and living a quiet life. But she was willing to talk. She told Chen her story. She told him about the assault. She told him about the cover-up. She told him about the injustice she had suffered. She told him about seeing Judge Whitmore's face on television and recognizing him as the man who had attacked her. Chen published his investigation. The story went viral. It became the biggest news story in the country. Judge Whitmore's past was exposed. His racism was exposed. His hypocrisy was exposed. He had spent 40 years as a judge, condemning criminals, sending people to prison, all while he himself was a criminal who had never been held accountable for his crimes. The Georgia Bar Association launched an investigation. They found that Judge Whitmore had engaged in judicial misconduct. They found that he had violated the judicial code of ethics. They found that he had abused his power. They recommended that he be disbarred. Judge Whitmore resigned from the bench before the disbarment proceedings could be completed. He disappeared from public life. Some say he moved to another state. Some say he went into hiding. The truth is that nobody knows what happened to him. But his legacy was clear. He had been exposed as a racist and a hypocrite. He had been removed from power. And justice, finally, had been served. Chief Justice Robert Mitchell became a hero. He was praised for his courage and his integrity. He was invited to speak at universities and conferences. He became a symbol of what it means to do the right thing, even when it is difficult, even when it is unpopular, even when it costs you something. Marcus Johnson was finally free. Not just physically, but spiritually. He was exonerated. His name was cleared. His record was expunged. He received a settlement from the state for his wrongful conviction. He used the money to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping the wrongfully convicted. He became an advocate for criminal justice reform. He became a voice for those who had been silenced by the system. Diane Foster also found peace. She was finally believed. Her assault was finally acknowledged. Justice was finally served, even if it came 47 years too late. She became an advocate for survivors of sexual assault. She worked with organizations dedicated to ending sexual violence. She found purpose in her pain. The case of Marcus Johnson and Judge Harold Whitmore became a landmark case in American judicial history. It became a case study in law schools. It became a symbol of the importance of integrity in the judicial system. It became a reminder that justice is not automatic. Justice requires courage. Justice requires integrity. Justice requires people who are willing to stand up and do the right thing, even when it is difficult. What do you think about this case? Leave your opinion in the comments. Share this video with your friends. Subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Stories that show the power of justice and integrity. And don't miss the next video. The Lawyer Who Challenged the System. The Story of Thurgood Marshall. Thank you for watching until the end.